Okay, good morning. So let's take a few moments while people gather so that we can gather ourselves. Take a moment to be present, first of all, present to ourselves. It's always the most difficult thing, but it's the first step in community and in any spiritual journey, to be present to our true selves. And then, as we're present to ourselves, little by little, that involves self-knowledge, coming to self-knowledge, we begin to be present to each other. And that's the beginning of truth. It's the beginning of love, in fact. And when we begin to be present to ourselves in this way, another dimension opens up, which is our presence to God. And we discover that God's presence to us is the ground of all presence. It's our capacity to be present to each other. And nothing helps us to do this better than attention and stillness. Good. So, welcome also to those who are with us, present with us in different parts of the world. Looking at the list of countries that were with us last night when we began the retreat, from Australia to Zimbabwe, with a message I got this morning from Catherine Charrier in Geneva saying that she had watched the opening session, the talk last night, while cooking dinner, and looking at the screen with one of her daughters, Eleanor, who remarked, I suppose, after she was watching us meditate, "How can they sit so still?" So, welcome to everybody, anyway. So I'd like to take our theme a little deeper this morning, the theme of solitude and community, drawing on the spiritual wisdom that we find in these two friends that we'll be walking the week with, Benedict and Shantideva, but watching this whole picture unfold in the light of the great symbols of Holy Week, and dipping in and discussing together later the meaning of those symbols in the light of these reflections of this story. It's very much a story, and the way that the Christian scriptures communicate to us is above all through a narrative, a great narrative, a meta-narrative which engages our own personal story. And it's about becoming real. It's about coming into the light of day and being real with ourselves, and real with other people, and truthful. And this is a story from the desert tradition that tells us. Wait a second. Would you mind closing the door? This is a story from the desert tradition that tells us about the dangers of being unreal. John the Dwarf, rather funny name, but rather like on Bere Island, people were given nicknames. So this was John the Dwarf. John the Dwarf spoke to his elder brother saying, "I want to be free of responsibilities, like the angels. They do no work other than constantly serving God." He then stripped naked and walked into the desert. A week later, he returned to his brother. When he knocked on his door, his brother called out, "Who's there?" "It's John. John has become an angel and no longer lives with us." Continuing to pound at the door, he said, "I really am your brother John." But his elder brother refused to open the door, leaving him outdoors until the next morning to teach him a lesson. When he finally opened the door, he said, "If you are a man, you need to work to support yourself. If you are an angel, why do you want to enter my cell?" And penitent, John said, "Forgive me, my brother." It's a very nice little story that, like many of the Desert Fathers stories, has many layers. One of them is our capacity, of course, for self-delusion, this idea that we can somehow walk away from our responsibilities in life, walk away from being who we are in the context in which we live and find ourselves, that we can just escape from ourselves. And that's one level, self-delusion. And the other is our need for relationship, to be real, to be ourselves, our need for community. And the solitude that John the Dwarf was trying to find in this angelic, sort of superhuman way, was a false solitude. It was really escapist. And when he comes back a week later, we don't know why he came back, but presumably he missed some of the comforts of home, or his own self-delusion began to wear off. He encountered a good teacher, tough love from his brother, who didn't just open the door, but wanted him to understand what was at stake and what was really the issue. And then, as we'll see later when we look at some of the other texts this morning, this turning point of asking for forgiveness, this moment of true repentance where we become connected with reality again through that kind of honesty. So there is deep in us a fantasy. It's a fantasy of self-sufficiency or a fantasy of happiness without responsibility. A fantasy of escaping the human condition, which can be very powerful, but escaping it on our own terms. I think Las Vegas is a very good example of that. I was only once in Las Vegas. I was giving some talks, but in the evening, not in the casinos, but in the evening after the talk, I was taken around the casinos, and but I certainly didn't see much glamour or excitement there, just this terrible compulsiveness and addiction. The effect of trying to escape reality is either addiction, which is a form of violence to ourselves, a violence that becomes compulsive, a violence we cannot stop. Or, of course, it can also manifest itself as cruelty, violence to others, to those who live in the real world. And if we are living in this fantasy of escape from the human condition and from our responsibleness, then those who live in the real world are a threat to us. They're a danger, because they're constantly reminding us or challenging us with reality. Rudolf Höss was the commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and he wrote his autobiography as he was in prison waiting for his execution. And the remarkable thing that the autobiography shows, and also all those who questioned him or interviewed him after he'd been arrested, was he showed absolutely no remorse and no sense of the reality of what he'd been doing, the world's biggest mass murderer. He seemed to be able, or seemed to have fallen into a completely fantasy world that reality could no longer penetrate, even after his world had collapsed. And he was able to operate the death factory of Auschwitz for quite a few years, and go home in the evening to his family of 5 children on the edge of the camp, and was a kind and loving father, apparently. So the unreal is the place of violence and evil. If we manage to indulge that fantasy of escape from responsibility, then we become dangerously capable of immense inhumanity and cruelty. And the story of the Passion of Jesus, that is the story which we turn over in our minds and hearts during these days of Holy Week. That story of the arrest and the betrayal, the arrest, the torture, the psychological and physical violence inflicted on Jesus and his death. This is a relentless expose, really, of the nature of violence, where violence comes from, and its source, but also its cure. The violence of betrayal is the first thing that we notice in that story, and we have all perhaps we've inevitably experienced betrayal in our lives. John Main used to say that one of the purposes of a Christian education is to prepare children for that experience of betrayal, because it comes with life as part of the package. Inevitably, we try to protect children from that experience of betrayal in their most vulnerable years. We try to make sure that we keep promises that we make to children, and we protect them from these painful experiences. We try to build them up so that when those experiences come, they will know how to deal with them. And betrayal comes in many forms. The weather betrays you when you plan a picnic and you can't go on the picnic because, or people in whom you placed hopes or had expectations let you down, or you let yourself down in different ways. So betrayal is a form of violence, and it's certainly the starting point of the Passion narrative. We don't know why Judas betrayed Jesus any more really than we know why Iago in Shakespeare's Othello works the terrible plot that leads to the tragedy of Othello murdering Desdemona, except for some kind of delight in the mischief that he's doing. So the story here leaves it rather open about where this motivation for betrayal comes from, but it certainly is a feature of all human relationships, and anyone living in community, or in marriage, or in the friendships of our lives, will inevitably experience betrayal at some point. It's a form of violence, and violence begets violence, usually. We see in the description of the arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane, Peter, who surprisingly is wearing a sword at the time, takes out his sword to defend Jesus and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus rebukes him, tells him that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So violence is no effective way of dealing with violence, of course. The cycle of violence, however, is pretty much the story of human history. And it's a cycle that we seem to be nailed to or addicted to. And here's a small graphic manifestation of it, right at the heart of Jesus' own community. You would think that Peter, of all people, would have got the message of the teaching of non-violence, but clearly the pattern is too strong. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus heals the high priest's servant's ear, but the violence, even from within his own community, shows us what the story is about and how deep it goes. And then you have the psychological violence of the trial, the false accusations and the mockery, the degradation of a human being, the stripping of their dignity, and then, of course, the physical violence, the torture, mocked and scourged, as we say. Nothing is more cruel than mocking someone who is on the ground, somebody who is defeated, somebody who is helpless and vulnerable. And yet we see from the footage of the concentration camps and the stories how easily human beings seem to enjoy the mockery and increasing the suffering of those who are already defeated and helpless. We see it in Auschwitz, we see it in Srebrenica, we see it in Syria today. It's the capacity of human beings to betray our capacity to be human. I was saying last night that a key word in understanding what we're talking about, thinking about this week, is leisure. And leisure is a space, it's a capacity that we have. And we've used this leisure this week. We've chosen to use it, those of you who've come to Bere Island, to make a retreat. And the way you use your time during this retreat is your use of leisure. And how we use leisure, how we use time, is very much at the heart of what we're talking about. Violence is the direct attack on every form of human community. You cannot belong to a community that chooses to inflict violence on another community or another group. To use violence is to destroy the community that you belong to, as well as an attempt to destroy the community of others. The solidarity of those who commit violence is a counterfeit community. It's too unnatural to become a real form of friendship or of loving concern for others. There's really no honor among thieves, or no love among those who are violent. And we see an example of that, I think, in the life of any community. We see it in, for example, the way Benedict identifies the dangers of factions, factionalism within the community. People, one group setting itself apart from the rest of the community, and also in the danger of gossip or murmuring, very deeply corrosive and divisive forms of activity within a community of any kind. So Auschwitz and Srebrenica are very extreme forms of violence that show just how deep and dangerous our capacity to abuse leisure can be, to abuse our capacity to be human, and how that capacity can be turned into sadism or finding pleasure in inflicting pain. But these are extreme distortions of human nature, of course, human nature and behavior. They attack the very nature of human community. But they have their origin in ourselves. Solzhenitsyn said the line between good and evil runs right through the middle of the human heart. And the reason that these horrific stories of collective violence and cruelty fascinate us and haunt us is because they warn us. They warn us that the seeds of these nightmares are within ourselves, within our own hearts and deep within our own psyches. That we all have a capacity for anger, for violence, and for fantasy. The fantasy that feeds and justifies that kind of anger. As I say, we need to see that these extreme stories reflect something quite domestic. Domestic violence is a very real form of violence in every society. Benedict identifies murmuring and factions, disobedience, giving false peace to each other, dishonesty, secret behavior, all forms of violence to the community that one has entered. We may have entered that community for different reasons. We may have entered it because we wanted security. People may go into a marriage for different reasons. Because they want security, they want conventionality, they think it's just time to get married. People go into monasteries sometimes because it's 3 meals a day and you don't have to worry about who pays the electricity bills. So there may be many levels of motivation that operate within any choice to go into community, and there may also be, of course, real love or real spiritual integrity, the desire to enter into the truth of oneself and to transcend one's limitations, to overcome one's fantasy and to be real. But whatever our motivation may be, community is not an escape. It cannot be an escape. Las Vegas is not real. It's a meeting with reality, meeting head-on. And therefore, the first fruit of community that we encounter, though we may not recognize it at first, is self-knowledge. It's the first thing that hits you when you begin to experience community. And we are humbled as soon as we begin to be known by others. As soon as we know that we are known, as soon as we see that others see us in ourselves, not necessarily that they discover some great secret about us that we want to hide, but just that they see us as we are. Human, not angelic, like John the Dwarf, but just real people who have moods, who make mistakes, who are sinful, who are weak, who are not glamorous. As soon as we see that we are seen in a real way by others, we are humbled. And humility is another word for self-knowledge. This is, of course, an essential aspect of human development, maturity. A mature person is someone who has come to be aware of themselves, who knows themselves, and accept themselves as they are. And we cannot come to that self-knowledge in isolation. You can only come to that self-knowledge through relationship. And we begin to see something of the paradox then of all human development, as well as of the spiritual journey. Maybe what we mean by the spiritual journey is simply human development. It isn't as if the spiritual journey is something that happens in an abstract realm or in another realm. The spiritual journey is the process of our human integration, transcendence, development. Whether or not we are religious, whether or not we know anything about the spiritual traditions that have commented upon this process of human development. So this is our spiritual journey, our human development. And the paradox that lies at the heart of this is this relationship between solitude and community. The roots of violence lie deep in our own nature, because that is where the basic conflict is present, the inner warfare of the soul. No one describes this better than some of the Christian mystics. And one of these, Blessed Paul Giustiani, from the 15th century. I'm reading a book about it at the moment. This is what he says about it. He's talking about the struggles of life. Everyone has struggles. There is, however, he says, a still harder conflict, which only gets worse, the hidden struggle of the spirit against itself. The spirit becomes its own enemy and insidiously attacks itself. It often proposes sham goods under the appearance of genuine good, and it is difficult to make out the danger. If it does good, it spoils it by self-satisfaction. If it practices mortification, it remembers that discretion has its rights as a pretext to relax its ascetic efforts. How often the spirit tells lies to deceive itself. For instance, if we yield to anger or impatience, it persuades us that this happens because of our concern for God's interests or our charity towards the neighbor whom we wish to correct. Nobody does violence without justifying it. Rudolf Höss justified it in his own mind. In short, the spirit disguises vices as virtues until it no longer distinguishes one from the other, and it falls a prey to itself. Well, that's a rather graphic and unpleasant description of what St. Paul describes as being divided against yourself. What I do is what I don't want to do. What I want to do, I find that I can't do, I don't do. So this is the source of violence, in fact. This is the conflict that leads to external violence within ourselves. And because it is so close to home, we prefer not to look at it, not to deal with it. And how do we do that? We project it outwards. We blame other people for making us feel this way. We scapegoat. The whole of the Passion story of Jesus is an illustration of the scapegoat mechanism in human relationships. We blame other people, we put our problems, our sins onto them, and we punish them, we blame them, we accuse them, we try to exterminate them. And usually, of course, we try to do that in a way that is easy to do, so that we can, we scapegoat the vulnerable, the people who can't resist, and they're the innocent victims, and the most vulnerable, usually a minority group, for example. So, the roots of violence, then, we see to exist within ourselves, within the conflict that we have with ourselves, the violence that we are capable of inflicting on ourselves unconsciously and mysteriously. Where does this come from? But it's there. Now, how do we deal with that? Maybe we can never fully understand where it comes from or why it happens, but it's universal. It's there in all of us. This capacity to hurt ourselves and then to project that hurt, in many cases, onto others. So how do we deal with it? Well, one traditional remedy was, and in many religious traditions, is to mortify yourself externally, to make life as unpleasant for yourself as possible. I was talking to an old monk some years ago who'd gone into the monastery, not a Benedictine monastery, I'm pleased to say, I think during the war, and he said that it was these were rather difficult times, and there weren't many luxuries in that form of monastic life he went into anyway. But the monks sort of competed with each other in their fasting and in their asceticism and the things they were giving up and the things they were denying themselves. And the more that they suffered, the more they competed, and the closer they believed they were coming to God. Now, we laugh at that, but actually it's a very universal religious response. And again, it seems to come out of some deep mechanism within the psyche. And it is very universal. Severe asceticism, self-restraint or denial, often extreme, inflicting pain on ourselves, like the hair shirt or scourging. I've seen it in Hindu rituals, and the Buddha, of course, tried it. Tried this way of extreme self-mortification and asceticism. And when he realized, just before it almost killed him, that it wasn't working, and he came to his senses and tried another way. And when he did that, and of course it led to his enlightenment then, the middle way. But when after his enlightenment, he came back to, I think it was to Sarnath, where he was to give his first teaching, and he encountered a group of 5 monks whom he had practiced these extreme ascetical exercises with before. And when they saw him, they mocked him. They said, "Look at this luxury-loving fellow who gave up fasting and fell back into a life of ease and comfort. Don't speak to him. Don't show him any respect." Very similar to the accusations that the Pharisees directed against Jesus, who was eating and drinking and dining with his disciples. And so there's a very universal religious pathology here. The pride that one takes in trying to live an angelic life by mortifying the senses or the body and inflicting pain upon ourselves as a way of becoming closer to God or achieving enlightenment. But as the Buddha came closer to them, to these 5 mocking ascetics, they were struck by something about him, something new, some quality of his being, a harmony, a graciousness, a dignity about him, radiance about him. And as they fell under the influence of his presence, they began to change and to stop mocking him and abusing him. And it was then that they were teachable, and he taught them the middle way that lies between self-indulgence and self-torture. As I say, Jesus was also accused of laxity and indulgence. But he too had learned in the solitude of his meditation how best to overcome the conflict deep within his own psyche, the conflict that inevitably leads us to violence in our relationship with others. We see Jesus doing this work in himself in the desert, the 40 days in the desert, which we relive during this season of Lent. And we see it even immediately before his death in the Garden of Gethsemane. So what Jesus goes through in the desert or the Garden of Gethsemane, and I think these are only particular periods in which we see this inner work being done in him. No doubt this was going on all the time as he was dealing with the conflicts with the Pharisees and the authorities who were rejecting him or mocking him, and no doubt dealing with it as he experienced the betrayal or the misunderstanding on the part of his own disciples, people he would have hoped, would have understood, would have got the message, and failed time and time again to understand. So I think, although we see these dramatic moments of the desert and of the garden, really throughout his life, in which there was a great deal of conflict and opposition, this resolution of what was deep in himself as a human being was happening continuously. And with the Buddha, we also see times of conflict, and his night of suffering under the Bodhi tree when he was assaulted by the demons within himself was his own form of crucifixion. So what we see in them and can discover in ourselves is the importance of community, the need for relationship, and also the fact that there is no true community without solitude. If we have no capacity for solitude, if we've no capacity, in other words, to meet and embrace our own uniqueness, then we really will have no capacity for marriage, or for friendship, or for community. We will constantly find ourselves being overwhelmed by the conflicts within ourselves that we project outwards onto others, or which become distortions of relationship. Solitude, therefore, involves struggle and pain. There's no way around that. And this is what the lesson of Holy Week is putting before us in a very honest way, but also in a very hopeful way. Because although it shows that we must enter into the struggle and the pain of solitude, this struggle and pain bears the fruit of deeper capacity for humanity, for a deeper capacity to be human. And that expresses itself in deeper human relationships and our capacity for love. The culmination of the passion of Jesus, of his struggle and pain, is this act of universal forgiveness. The agape, the boundless love that flows out of his broken heart. The compassion that fills him and flows out from him to embrace all peoples. So, as I say, one of the ways of dealing with this conflict within ourselves that we have to face and own, one of the ways we can see offered to us to deal with it is mortification. Punishing ourselves or denying legitimate pleasures to ourselves. There's something rather perversely attractive about that, perhaps because the ego feels it's in control, but it doesn't work. If it worked, maybe it would be acceptable, but it doesn't work. The alternative is meditation. Meditation is a form of asceticism. It's an exercise, it's a practice. It involves a certain degree of withdrawal, as I was saying yesterday, the withdrawal of solitude, and a certain level of self-denial. When we meditate, we say no to our fantasy, to our thoughts, to our impatience or our restlessness. There is a certain level of self-restraint in meditation, in the stillness of it, in the steadiness of it, in the discipline of it. But it is not in any way violent. It's not violence against ourselves, it's certainly not violence against others. It is more effective than any other kind of extreme asceticism or external discipline. The middle way is not necessarily easier. Meditation is the supreme middle way. It's a narrow path, as Jesus says, that leads to life. It's a knife edge. It's a tightrope. And we admire and are fascinated by pictures of, or the sight of people trying to walk a tightrope between the Twin Towers or across the Grand Canyon, or in a circus. And we imagine how difficult it would be, and we can easily imagine how we would go 2 or 3 steps before we fall off. And that's, of course, what happens. When we start to walk the tightrope of the middle way, we immediately fall off. We experience failure within seconds of starting to meditate. We very quickly are told that the ego, that we are not in control of this spiritual journey. We begin to sense that the call to walk this middle way comes from a place deeper than the ego, and also that the resources we need to do it come from this same deeper place. In other words, we can't do it by ourselves. It's virtually impossible to learn to follow this middle way on your own. To follow the middle way is to embrace solitude, but we cannot be in solitude alone or in isolation. Mistakes and failures are inevitable. The first thing we have to learn to do when you start to practice meditation seriously is failure management. How are you going to deal with the fact that you are failing all the time? The first thing you realize is that perfectionism is not helpful. That perfectionism is going to undermine all your efforts and eventually bring you to give up. So you have to give up perfectionism, or you will give up the practice. The way we deal with this in the wisdom of the spiritual masters is not to conceal the failure, but to confess it. In Shantideva, in chapter 2 of the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, he speaks about the confession of sin. Whatever sin I, a brute, he says, have committed or caused others to commit in this life, and anything in which I have deludedly rejoiced, so any way in which I've deceived myself, thereby harming myself, that transgression I confess, overcome by remorse. Whatever offense I have committed out of disrespect with my body, speech, and mind against the 3 jewels, against mothers and fathers, and against spiritual mentors and others, and whatever terrible vices I, a sinner, defiled with many faults, have done, O guides, I confess them all. How shall I escape it? Rescue me quickly. May death not soon creep up on me before my vices have vanished. I have considered that I am ephemeral. Due to delusion, attachment, and hatred, I have sinned in many ways. So the confession, or the being open about our failure, is an essential aspect of walking the middle way. And we cannot confess to ourselves. We have to admit to ourselves, but we cannot confess to ourselves. And that's where community is of crucial importance in our journey. St. Benedict even more explicitly deals with the failures and the faults that we fall into on the spiritual path. And because he's writing about life following this middle way within community explicitly, he shows how important community is for dealing with these problems. The need for confession and for openness. That our faults, our failures are healed in and through community by being known and of course by being forgiven. But again, this is not as easy as it may sound. Listen to what he says in his chapter on this issue. If a brother is found to be obstinate or disobedient or proud or a murmurer or habitually transgressing the rule in any point or contemptuous of the orders of his seniors, then the latter should admonish him secretly a first and a second time, as our Lord commands. So Jesus said, when one of you commits a fault within the community, it doesn't have to be exposed immediately. A couple of responsible people can go and talk with you about it. And if that works, great. Then you get the point, you accept the rebuke, and you try to do better. But if it doesn't work, then what? Because the ego can be very resilient and very hard-hearted. So if he fails to amend, let him be given a public rebuke in front of the whole community. And now we begin to get a little nervous, don't we? It doesn't sound very good psychology to us. But even then, if he doesn't reform, let him be placed under excommunication. So that sounds really even more unpleasant to us. Although he adds, provided he understands the seriousness of that penalty. So in other words, this is not punishment. This is a form of healing. It's a medicine. It's tough medicine. And it's only being administered by a wise and a loving physician, because the easier forms of cure didn't work. So this may seem shocking to us, this idea that of rebuke and even of excommunication. But it's a kind of it shows the seriousness and the depth of the problem that we looked at the beginning when we thought about violence, how deep these roots go. The medicine has to correspond to the seriousness of the illness. And in these great spiritual teachers, violence itself is seen as a sickness. It's a disease of the soul as well as a a failure of the imagination, as it's been called. And it isn't cured by inflicting suffering on ourselves or by having suffering inflicted on us. It is actually only cured, as the story of Holy Week reminds us, it's only really cured by faithful love. It's the only cure for violence. The violence we find within our own self-conflict, whatever its origins, that manifests itself in our conflicts with each other in relationship. This faithful love is also the meaning of forgiveness. And this will involve, however, some kind of suffering. But it becomes a redemptive suffering. It's not the suffering that heals us. It's the faithful love or forgiveness that heals us. But there will be a form of redemptive suffering involved in order for this love to be communicated. And that gently begins to edge us towards understanding the meaning of Good Friday.